Alternative Radio.
You are listening to Texas History Lessons, a slow walk through Texas history made in Texas by a Texan for everyone everywhere.
The book you're writing, is that for your graduate studies, or is that just an independent thing you're doing for tying it together?
Good question. The book I'm writing right now, which is almost complete, I have one more chapter to finish. It's called Wrangling Pelicans, and it's pretty much a social history of presidio soldiers.
Oh.
So I give like a ground up view of the soldiers who manned the forts that the Spanish had in Texas and all along the northern border, and that's just for my own my own pleasure and something just to publish. And then the Karankawas research will be my dissertation.
Excellent
Book.
Okay, that'll help me. I will bring both of those up. I'm excited about the book. I didn't know you were working on that, and that's going to be really exciting.
It really got going quite quick. It was a research paper. It just was so fun to write about and just so much information to include. I was like, I might as well extend this to a book. And I was listening to your latest, or one of your latest ones on the internal provinces, and I was like, I'm really happy that Michael's into this type of stuff too. I think he'd be my audience for the book.
Oh, definitely. As soon as you mentioned what the book's about, I'm like, oh my God, send me a copy now. I would love to see, because we'll get into this when we start actually recording here, but that's one of the reasons I started the podcast was personally, I realized there's a lot I missed out on, even in graduate school. I just didn't learn. There's such a deeper story, and that's why I'm interested in this. I'm just learning that there's a whole world, literally a whole history that happened here in the state that kind of just gets passed over. Yeah, there was a mission period, and it didn't go very well, and blah, 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 and insignificant, all this stuff. But really, there's a rich, deep story about the life that happened here for hundreds of years before, Stephen Austin ever heard of Texas, So
I'm so happy you bring that up, because the Spanish era of Texas, and I probably shouldn't label the Spanish era because the native people were in control at the time, but that whole time period is just so fascinating, and the stories that come out of it are just so interesting, and not a lot of people have written about it because not a lot of people are, done the research because they don't read Spanish or know where the archives are. So, I think it's definitely right for a lot of research. That's
something I'm glad you brought up. You know what? Just to heck with it. We're already recording. We did our little test. I'm going to do an introduction here. Welcome to Texas History. I'm Michael, and I'm happy today to have Tim Seiter on with me. He's a PhD student at
SMU, the history department at SMU.
SMU History Department, yeah. I found you through, I guess it was through your website. You have a website up on the Karankawas, and that's back when I started the podcast. I was really excited about all the information you had on that. I think we had contacted some. You've been a Patreon supporter for me just because you're a cool dude, and and we've talk back and forth a little every once in a while, but mostly after I had my conversation with Mr. Melvin Edwards about his book, The Eyes of Texans, I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed having somebody on that knew a lot about the subject that I was just interested in. And that's why I reached out to you immediately. I said, let's talk to Tim and get some information about a subject that I'm still learning about, as we were just talking about. And one of the things that you pointed out is, and this is something I'm dealing with personally here and trying to give the proper attention, is even though we call it Spain or Spanish Texas or New Spanish Texas or, the French period when France attempted to have a part of Texas there with La Salle, it never really was, for the most part, theirs. You look at the maps, and they'll show this great map from all the Spanish territory, all the way up into the northwest. They didn't really have control of it. It was still the indigenous people's land. You know,
that's really important to point out. And then if we look at a lot of the history books being released today about Spanish Texas or about this time period, there's an increased focus on showing native dominance. So there's a famous book called Peace Came in the Form of a Woman,
yes,
by Juliana Barr. And her main thesis, the simplest way to break it down, is that Texas was native ground, that natives controlled diplomatic exchanges, they controlled how they interacted with Europeans. And so when you think of Texas prior to, let's just say, the 1800s, you should think of Texas as one where natives are exacting tribute from Europeans. They're going to European forts and they're getting goods. That the Europeans, they have settlements there and they claim to have all this land on their maps, but in reality, they're small little islands of Spanish power in the midst of ocean of native power. So this was not European land. Natives were the ones controlling everything.
Exactly. That's very similar. I'm familiar with that book. I recently got a version of that. I'm gonna use and research on, and it's also similar to the work that's been done by, and I'm gonna butcher this name. You can maybe help me out. I'm sure you are aware of Pekka Hamalainen or Hapalainen.
Exactly.
However you say that.
So I'm sure your listeners are also aware of his Comanche Empire, and that's great, right? Like incorporating a Native American group as an empire.
Mm-hmm.
And he's doing the same thing with his latest book, Lakota America. It's a very similar book to Comanche Empire, but it's interesting to see that Lakota America, Hamalainen's latest book, has gotten a lot of controversial responses to that. And I think the reason for it is because he's not including Native peoples when he's writing this history. So that's kind of how the field has gone from, that's where it's at presently. Mm-hmm. Where if you're writing a history of the Karankawas, for instance, I need to contact people that identify as Karankawa today and talk to them about the history I'm writing and get their input into that history. And so Hamalainen's great for showing the Native dominance, but recently he hasn't been contacting Native peoples, which is now considered to be the norm.
I see. Okay, let's before we get into all this exciting stuff,
Sure.
Tim, where are you from, and when did you realize history is something you were going to be interested in and pursue to the extent that you were going to go to SMU and pursue a graduate degree?
A good question. So I'm originally from a town called Friendswood, and it's between Houston and Galveston. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do. When I got to college, I actually withdrew from the University of Houston after like a week when I was enrolled, and I decided to walk the Appalachian Trail. I did like 1,000+ miles on the Appalachian Trail, and then the next year I did around 1,500 miles on the PCT. And after walking all those long-distance trails, I really realized how wonderful it is to go to school and just learn and study full-time. So I went back to community college, and I had the cliche story of having a really good professor named Andrew Joseph Pagoda, and he was my history professor, and he really was the one that pushed me into this field of history. I mean, who doesn't love to read about all this real-life drama? Once I found myself enthralled with history, I just kept going up through those different levels and finally applied to SMU, which has a phenomenal Southwestern focused graduate school. And here I am. I'm currently a graduate candidate at SMU, and I should be finishing my dissertation, which I'll turn into a book on the Karankawa peoples in 2 years. I think I have 2 years left of funding. So that's my quick story in a little nutshell.
Wow, you had me at the Appalachian Trail. You're quite an adventurer, also. I mean, and part of your growing up down where you did, you had access to, and I've seen pictures that you've explored the Gulf Coast in kayaks, right? I mean, you've tried to visit and find where the Karankawas lived and actually experienced it.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Because I lived on land that was like the Karankawas, it was easy for me to access it. But I never really lived on the coast itself. So me and some buddies got some kayaks and actually kayaked to some historical spots and camped there for the night, and just, I guess, to get an idea of what it would be like to live out there on a day-to-day basis. And I'll tell you that our experience on all of our kayak trips have been wonderful, but at the same time terrible. There's like no shade. We ended up having to stack our kayaks one on top of the other and like hide behind them so we wouldn't get even more sunburned. The mosquitoes were crazy. The wind was nonstop. So it definitely gave me a newfound respect for the native peoples I was writing about.
Well, that's pretty perfect that you brought that up, because this is where they survived and lived, and it kind of gave you a similar feeling to maybe what the survivors of the Norveas expedition that got crashed onto the barrier islands down there. What they experienced, it's like it probably was similar to that.
Absolutely. I mean, reading Griswold's account and all the other survivors, it's pretty wild. I like what you said, how they survived very well in this harsh environment, and the Karankawa people, as I'm saying, really thrived in this area. That they had thousands. Their population was considered to be 8,000 at the time. They had permanent settlements, during European occupation. That they thrived in this environment despite its harsh nature.
That's a good question. Let's go back. I'm going to start with a series of questions. So, because I had you on, because you have put more time in on understanding these people than probably anybody I know of. Okay, first of all, who were the Karankawas and where did they live, and what were the situation, how did they live? Because they've been categorized as the most primitive people by older research, and it might not necessarily be the case from things I've been reading in other people's books recently.
I'm just going to write these questions down so I address them point by point.
Yes.
And then how did they live? Okay. So the Karankawas, I'll answer the first question. Who are the Karankawas? Now we have to do some clarification. Karankawa is a umbrella term for people who share the same Karankawa culture. So Karankawa kind of includes all the people that spoke the same language, Karankawan, and had a similar culture and similar ceremonies. And there are 5 main groups under that umbrella, and some of these groups change over time, and we don't know if there's more groups prior to European contact. I'll try to do them off the top of my head. I believe there's the Copans, who are more aligned with the Spanish, the Guajanos, the Cocos, Guapites, I think, and then the Karankawas, which is where Karankawas is derived from. It's a Spanish name for one of the largest Karankawa tribes. So that's who the Karankawas are. They're a collection or a culture of people. They speak the same language. They have a similar culture. Where did the Karankawas live? They span from around the bays of Galveston all the way down to, we can push the southernmost extent to Baffin Bay. So a large area of land. But it's significant for us to point out that their territory changes over time. So as you mentioned earlier, whenever Griswold and these other conquistadors crash land on the Texas Gulf Coast, they land on Follett Island or around Galveston Island. And that was, at that time, the northern extent of the Karankawas land. But over the next 100 years, we see that land kind of shrink down and then expand up again. And so we need to make sure we're aware that the Karankawas land isn't just hard set, that it is constantly moving back and forth. And then how the Karankawas lived. I'm really happy you brought up that older histories portray them as the most barbaric and savage and crude people, and that's just not accurate at all. A lot of this misinformation stems from Spanish accounts and Anglo-American accounts of the Karankawas, and when I say that, we have to understand that the Karankawas were able to defend their territory for longer than the United States has been a nation. So they defended their territory from the Spanish, they defended their territory from Anglo-Americans, they defended from the Mexicans as well. And because of this, and because they were so effective at this defense, these enemies, Anglo-Americans and Mexicans, and the Spaniards, have a lot of sources where they talk shit about the Karankawas. And so the first historians kind of just latched onto these sources as if they were totally accurate. But when we look at archaeologically, we see that the Karankawas had an extremely diverse diet. It was so diverse that they were considered to be taller than most Native Americans in the entirety of Texas, that they weren't nomadic. They didn't just move around mindlessly looking for food. They actually had permanent settlements that these settlements had populations of more than 500 people. And so they were semi-nomadic, they were settled, they had extremely advanced technology for fishing, particularly for making canoes. I think it's important for us to know that they weren't just some backwards people. Although the Kados, of course, were settled and sedentary and had agriculture established, the Karankawas, the environment they lived in wasn't conducive to large degree farming, and so they made do what they had, and they flourished, as I mentioned previously. But hopefully that answered all of your
No,
questions.
that's fascinating to me. How over time, even Newcomb's book, which I was going to ask you, how does his work hold up compared to some of the more recent? I mean, it's pretty blatantly racist, and even in parts the way he is. But he does have a lot of pertinent information that he gathered over time, and it was the standard for a long time. I mean, Lever's book is one of the best ones, I guess, in recent history that's been written. And then there was the work of Rickless, I can't remember his first name, where I saw that's where you touched on the fact that they did have permanent locations, but they had to move. They moved cyclically during the year.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, you're bringing up a lot of great books. I think that Newcomb's, I'm going to actually look up the title. It's like The Indians of Texas or something along those lines.
Yeah.
His book was a really big game changer. It's definitely absolutely racist. He's ranking these cultures based on like their technological advancements. And those advancements, it's like if you can farm, your culture is more advanced than another culture, which is problematic. But the reason why Newcomb's book is so important is because he's finally starting to look at all the sources and look at them objectively and see, like, okay, this doesn't make sense. Like, so Lisa's testimony looks a little bit biased. Maybe we shouldn't use this. And ever since then, as you pointed out, we have Lever, we have Rickless, we have Himmel, we have Foster, who are all writing much better histories of the Karankawas. I do think that the history of the Karankawas has improved markedly. It's just continued to improve. And now with the Karankawa Tabla, which is this kind of resurgence of Karankawa identified people, their image in the historical record is really improving. So that's really good news.
That's interesting that you want to. I asked on Twitter last night if anybody had questions. Let's go ahead and touch on one of them.
Sure.
And it'll also touch on Newcomb, because if I'm not mistaken, Newcomb pretty much, and lots of history books over time, Texas history books, just say that, well, the Humanos are extinct. The Coahuiltecans are extinct. The Karankawas are extinct. They no longer exist. But one of the beauties of social media and internet that we were talking about before we started recording is there's an ability to connect with people. And so when I was doing my early episodes on the Coahuiltecans, the Humanos, I actually found people and had conversations with them. And, you know, I saw that you had the Karankawas are alive and well today.
Exactly.
And one of the explanations that I want you to address this as well, and while you're talking about the modern Karankawas, that it was a survival mechanism because the racism against Indians was so bad, and they did intermarry into the Mexican culture, that they identified as Mexican rather than Native American, even though at home they carried on their traditions and passed on the stories and things like that. But it was a survival mechanism. But, you know, we've progressed, thank goodness, as people. We slowly get things right sometimes. And now people are coming out and grasping their identity, and they don't have to hide anymore.
Yeah, I think this is such a fascinating subject, and this is kind of the prime area which my book will cover. This idea of, are the Karankawas extinct? How do they reform? Are they still here today? And the answer is, like, they're not extinct. They're definitely still here. But I'll give us some background. Mm-hmm. So I'll say that all the way up into maybe the 1820s, the Karankawas still held on tightly to their identity. They were still in control of their coast. But whenever you have Anglo-Americans coming in the United States, crossing the border from Louisiana, coming into North Texas, they just overwhelm the Karankawa people. And Austin's land grant is, prime in Karankawa territory. So you just have thousands and thousands of settlers coming in and living differently than the Spaniards. So the Spaniards, they always kind of consolidated into towns. They had ranches, of course, but they lived together in towns. That was easier for the Karankawas to manage. But these Anglo-Americans came and they homesteaded. So they just came and they plopped down in the middle of the Karankawas territory. The Karankawas couldn't control their land as well as they could. And so around the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and to the 50s, the Karankawas power really begins to recede. And what happens is you have Anglo-American settlers conducting extermination campaigns to rid the land of the Karankawas and hunting down and killing Karankawas. And so what the Karankawas do is they, one, incorporate with other Native American groups. Two, they flee into Mexico and try to establish themselves in northeast Mexico. And then three, which is the people I've been interviewing most, this is kind of what they've done, is they would incorporate themselves into the society. So they would label themselves as Mexican and try to pass as Mexican, but still hold on to their identity as Karankawa. It's interesting that I would say up until 2000, maybe 18, the Karankawas were still considered by most academics to be extinct. There was an individual, a man named Enrique Gonzalez, who I believe in 2009 went to the newspaper and said he was the last Karankawa alive, that he was the last Karankawa Indian still living. And this academic from Brownsville just shut him down and said, there's no way you could be a Karankawa, there's no way. But you brought it up. Starting in 2018, people, and starting whenever I began to release my research too online on my Karankawas blog, all these people started to get in touch with each other and create a community, and they all had oral histories from their past about how they, their grandmother was a Karankawa woman and all the rituals attached to that. And so starting, I believe, in 2018, 2019, around 60 to 100 people formed a group called the Karankawa Kade. And what that means is mixed Karankawa. Kade in the Karankawa language is calico. So it's translated to English as mixed Karankawa. And all these people don't identify as being full-blooded Karankawas. They do identify as having partial Karankawa blood and also Hispanic heritage. And so that's how they survived. And I'm really happy that you were talking to the Coatecan people in which the same thing happened, because they've really been pushing for a similar identity. But it's tricky, right? Because the state doesn't recognize the Karankawas. The federal government doesn't either. So you have a lot of naysayers who don't believe their oral histories. And so what I'm doing in my work is I'm actually tracking down, I'm finding the documents to show that the Karankawas still survived. And I've been pretty successful, where I can actually point to a Karankawa individual and follow her ancestry, the people that are her descendants, all the way up to the present. I've done that with 2 families now. Yeah, I think that's a good answer to that question too.
That's quite amazing. Down in the San Antonio area, I think I'm saying this correctly, the Tate Pilum people, their Hoyet Tacons
exactly.
that were there, and they were the people that, the missions were for, and they were the people that were living there for a long time before the Spanish ever showed up. And, they're having this big struggle right now because all this stuff that's being done with the Alamo. And their ancestors' bodies are underneath that sidewalk that you're walking on. And they just want recognition. And, it's a big battle that they're fighting to get some kind of acknowledgement. But the state says, well, it's a cemetery of no historical significance. Mm-hmm. Now, the Karankawas now, let's just go ahead and I have several more questions about the history, but the Karankawas now have a fight that they're conducting involving an important situation down on the Gulf Coast in the Galveston area. You want to go ahead and talk about that a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. So this brings us back to something we spoke about earlier, and that's that the Karankawas had permanent settlements where they would come back to seasonally, in the winter. So every winter they would come back to these permanent settlements and live there. And there's a settlement on McGlowan's Bluff, and this is located in northeast Corpus Christi. It's right on the bay. And it was inhabited by the Karankawas from the 1300s to the 1700s. So the space was inhabited for hundreds of years. And around 1950, some local from Corpus Christi told an archaeologist that he found Indian mounds in the area. And this archaeologist came to this Karankawa settlement and found more than 3,000 artifacts, pottery shards, arrowheads just lying on the surface. Just easy to pick up and grab, no digging necessary. And so that's really all that happened for that land for, from the 50s to the 90s, really nothing happened. It was just totally available. You would have people coming, stealing artifacts, taking what they wanted. And then come the 1990s, a U.S. military Navy base was built there. Mm-hmm. And after that military base was decommissioned, the Corpus Christi Port Authority wanted to make sure that they could sell this land, that there's no historically important artifacts on this land. And so they did a legit archaeological study, and they uncovered, over the span of 5 years, 40,000 Karankawa artifacts on McGlowan's Bluff. And so the Karankawa people today recognize this as a sacred site, a sacred space where their ancestors lived for hundreds of years. But the big controversy is that the current, the current tenant of the land goes by Enbridge, and they're a natural gas company. And they're looking to build a pipeline bridge right atop of this land and destroy the land and destroy the artifacts that are still on that land. The Karankawa don't want that to happen. They want to make this space a wildlife refuge where the public can also come and enjoy it themselves. And they want to protect the environment along that coast, because although the pipeline terminal little pier will obviously destroy the land that is needed to get out of the way to build it, the oil rig or the oil ships that are going to be docking there, they end up destroying this seagrass. So what happens is they're so large that when they dock on this pier, they kick up so much mud and sand that it buries the seagrass and kills off all the seagrass. And seagrass is extremely important for maintaining a healthy environment. So you have shrimp and fish that rely on this seagrass to survive. And so whenever it dies off, these fish and shrimp also die off or go elsewhere. And if there's no fish and shrimp on this stretch of coast, that means that the birds and these other animals that live on the land also aren't going to be, visiting this part of the land either way. So it's very complicated, but that's, I think, the simplest gist of it. And there's been many different protests around Houston, Corpus Christi, and Austin to kind of halt this destruction of a Karankawa sacred space.
That's fascinating. And you have, I think I briefly mentioned, you have a pretty awesome website where is there a link on that to the Karankawa people? Or I know there's some kind of a message on your website about this situation.
Yeah, there should be a link. The easiest way to learn more information about this is to type in stop Enbridge. Enbridge is spelled E-N and then just bridge.com. And that has like the most up-to-date information. I know that some folks were trying to update the website even more. But yeah, thanks for asking about that.
Yeah, your website is pretty much the go-to for anybody that's curious about more on this subject, because you've done a lot of work on that. And, you know, the artwork, where did you get that? Because the artwork is pretty amazing in its own right, too.
Yeah, it's great. So I'm really into rock climbing, and there's an artist I met while I was rock climbing once. And ever since I met her, I thought her work was amazing. And so whenever I end up writing an article, I let her read my article or my work, and then she just creates whatever she wants out of it. And so she's, since then she's created these portraits of Karankawa peoples that lived in Texas around like the 1600s. She's created all these other different portraits for articles I've written. Yeah, so she's done all the original artwork on the Karankawas.com website. She's really talented.
Now, is that Michelle Wang?
Yeah, exactly.
Because I'm looking at a copy of, I didn't mention this yet. You were talking about the Karankawa struggle and fight to control their land. Well, you actually had an article published in the Southwestern Historical Quarterly back in April of 2021. And not only do you have an article in it, her artwork is on the cover, which is a pretty astonishing piece of art in itself. You want to talk about what your article was about there, and did you talk with her about the concept for that art, or did she just come up with that by herself? Yeah,
awesome research yourself, Michael. Way to uncover that. Yeah. So the article is on the Karankawa Spanish War, and this war lasted from around 1778 to 1789. And it was a war that I uncovered through all these primary sources that other historians hadn't really dug into. You had some folks like John Wheat and Elizabeth John who knew about these sources, but not many other people. And so during this war, the Spaniards are wanting to control the Karankawa's land. They want to have a port or build a port on the coast, but the Karankawas control the coast. And the Karankawas are also kind of raiding their territory, and so they want to get rid of the Karankawa people. And so they begin to put together all these extermination campaigns. They actually try to commit genocide on the Karankawa people, but it does not work out for them at all. The Karankawas are so proficient and effective during this war that ultimately the Spaniards are having to pay tribute to the Karankawa people for it to end. And at the very end of the war, the Spaniards actually build another mission for the Karankawas to dispense gifts to these Indian people. So yeah, the war was not effective at all. And so the article just goes in depth about what happened during this time. And I gave that article to Michelle before it was published. And she read it all. She read all 30 pages, and I gave her no instruction about what she could do. And she created this amazing painting, which you have the Presidio La Bahia or Mission Rosario in the background. You have a shipwreck, which plays a big deal in the story. And then you have, a Karankawa individual in the canoe, and the Spaniards trying to build their own canoes ineffectively. So it ties all into the article, and she did a wonderful job.
No, it's a great piece of art, and the article itself is a fine piece of scholarship. You, that's going to be part of your work on this is going to be part of what you're working on at SMU, but you're also working on a book that's separate from all this. You want to mention that your research on that?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm about to publish a book called Wrangling Pelicans, The Daily Life of Presidial Soldiers in 18th Century Texas. So to make that as simple as possible, I'm writing a book on the daily life of soldiers, Spanish soldiers who lived in Texas during the 1700s. And as I'm sure a lot of your listeners know as well, the Spanish had around 3 or 4 forts in Spanish Texas throughout this period, and around 20 to 50 men manned these forts. And you have other scholarship, like a book called The Presidio from Max Moorhead, that kind of deals with this type of stuff, but it looks at it from an institutional point of view. So we learn about what the soldiers were paid, what their leaders did to, make the Presidio better. We don't get it from their point of view. And so my book will really be covering that. Like, what was it day-to-day, hour-by-hour life like for a soldier? What would they be doing? And when it really comes down to it, their day-to-day life was guarding the horse herd, escorting people from one city to the next. They would not very frequently be attacking native peoples, and if they tried to, they were not effective. Their life was not as exciting as people tend to think, but of course there were very exciting moments. The book is called Wrangling Pelicans, and it's given that name based on this order that King Carlos gave to the soldiers of the fort at present-day Goliad. And King Carlos is king of Spain. He sends a letter to the viceroy, and he says, I want a flock of pelicans. So the viceroy sends that letter to present-day Goliad and tells the soldier, hey, go get some pelicans for the king. But what the king doesn't know, what the viceroy doesn't know, is that all these pelicans, most of them are in the Karankawas territory, deep in the Karankawas territory. And so for all we know, for all intents and purposes, the soldiers just ignored the order and didn't do anything. Yeah. And so that's kind of the big point of my book, is that the superiors of these presidials think that the soldiers will do whatever they say. But when we really get down to the bones of it, the soldiers had a lot more agency and power than we expect. Fun fact, a little fun tidbit, King Carlos, I think a couple of years later, doesn't want pelicans anymore. He wants a buffalo, a bison. And so he sends a similar order up to, present-day San Antonio. And you actually have some citizens hunt down some bison and send them all the way. I think one survives the journey all the way back to New Spain. There's a great article about that in the Southwestern Historical Quarterly.
That's pretty amazing. I'm really looking forward to you publishing that. That's going to be, what kind of, how am I going to phrase this question? It takes a lot of work to do what you're doing. And how do you find these resources? Where are these resources? I'm pretty sure you must be having to deal with a lot of Spanish documents. And what's the process that's been you've been dealing with for researching this book?
Yeah, it's a great question, especially because, here, I'll lay it out this way. First, I'll start everything off and say that Texas historians are very fortunate that Texas puts a lot of money into its history. And because of that, they're at the Dolph Briscoe Archives at the University of Texas. We have these phenomenal translators. Probably the foremost among them is a man named John Wheat, and he is absolutely phenomenal. He's translated so many Spanish documents, and I'll tell you, I've gone there in person. I've looked at these documents online as well, where I can zoom in, and I've tried to translate the Spanish, the Castilian Spanish written in the 1700s, and oh God, it is so hard. I think it took me 2 full days to translate one document, but this translator, John Wheat's able to knock them out like in an hour or two. He's amazing.
That is amazing. There's an online resource called the Portal to Texas History where you can see scanned copies of a lot of these documents like that, and it's really hard to read. That's the
absolutely.
nitty gritty part of the historian's work
amazing.
is like when you're actually getting in there and actually going through files and folders. You know, way back in time, I was sat at the Amon Carter Museum going through Amon Carter's papers and reading notes and things, handwritten stuff, trying to make out, well, what's that letter? And, you know, did the same thing at TCU with Jim Wright's papers when he was Speaker of the House and as a congressman. And just going through and just trying to filter through all this information. And, you know, you're doing that in another language. And you have the benefit, though, of this amazing group of interpreters, though. But that's kind of the fun part of being a historian, is like you're being a detective here.
Yeah, I'm glad you I'm happy you brought up these other your own experience, because even if they're in English, it's so difficult. I was looking at Stephen F. Austin's handwriting, and it's pretty good by the day's standard. But even then, I couldn't understand a single word of it at times.
Yeah.
Right, so even if it's in English, and the same thing is true with this Castilian Spanish, where they're writing it and they all have these abbreviations, which I'm like, I have no idea what they mean, and they don't want to write out the whole word, so they abbreviate it. But if I don't know Castilian Spanish very well, so it was very, very difficult for me. I did my fair share of that. But I would say the most of the work, most of Wrangling Pelicans relies on translated sources by experts like John Wheat. But it brings us to our next topic, is that, you know, a lot of these archival sources are not written by common soldiers. The book I'm writing is about the people, the privates, the surgeons, corporals, the people that aren't high-ranking military officials. But the high-ranking military officials are the ones creating all these documents, most of these documents that we see in the archives. So how do you get the voices of the privates? How do you get those perspectives? And my answer to it is kind of straightforward and like beating my head against the keyboard. But I have been literally reading through every single document in the Bayer archives.
Wow. And
piecing it together, just the typical daily life of these soldiers. And I follow one soldier in particular named Antonio Trevino, and I follow him from his birth and to him moving from Texas. And, you know, he joins the presidio, I believe, when he's 18. He ends up he's a smuggler. He smuggles in all sorts of different stuff. He's an Indian diplomat. He gets himself in trouble sometimes. And ultimately, he's promoted all the way up to lieutenant. And leaves Texas. So we get to see his kind of promotion and how he's promoted. And I think it's the first kind of on the ground social history of presidios in Texas. We have another author, Mark Santiago, who does this, Santiago in New Mexico. But I'm really looking forward to publishing this book.
I'm looking forward to it. A lot of people are going to be excited about this. I think it's an important contribution. And between that and your work on the Karankawas, how do you have time to do all of this, man? Because it is. A lot of people don't realize it's a lot of work just to come up with this and look into these things.
Yeah, I mean, you wrote your master's on the Trinity River, right?
Right. The development and environmental, yeah.
And you know firsthand just how long it takes to produce this type of scholarship. And there's only like two groups of people personally that I think can write, that have the time available to write history. The first are students like myself and professors who are funded by universities. I'm very fortunate to be given $20,000 a year to live off of. It's very small. I'm definitely struggling on food at times, but that's one group. The other group are retired folks, because otherwise, if you're not retired, it's just so much work. And do you feel the same way about that?
It's at the level of work that I do, where I lean heavily on published work by other historians, and I try to do my own amount. I try to dig into primary sources as often as I can. This takes an astronomical amount of time just to do it, write some notes for a 30-minute episode. You know, it does, but I do it because I love it, and I love learning, and I love sharing what I learn. You know, I don't claim to be an expert on it, but I feel that if I put the effort in, that at least it's coming out and helping other people understand things that hadn't been seen before. Because recently I just did an episode on the Black Seminoles, and I'd always heard about, the Seminoles and Black Seminoles that ended up in Texas. And I never learned much more past that. But then when I actually started digging into learning about that, I'm completely right now fascinated with their entire story from the time of, the black slaves escaping and moving into Florida, and then their whole journey this way, and then into Mexico, where there's still a community of Black Seminoles down there. The Kickapoos live down there. I don't know. We find the time to do what we love, and that's why I do it too. Yeah, it's a lot of work though.
I mean, your podcast is fantastic. I've been listening to episodes for quite some time, and you're always very accurate. And even the latest episode, I really appreciated that you're talking about, should we use like the term Indians, or should we just label them by their tribal name? And I love your response about how, I respect them. And because I respect them, I make sure to call them by the Comanches or the Karankawas instead of just those Indians. I think you're fantastic. And your voice, too, your voice is perfect for a podcast. Like, whenever you first called me and I picked up, I was wondering if you would sound like you do on the podcast. I was wondering if you just, put on a voice, but no, that's your normal voice. And it's
no, that's my North Texas country boy voice right there, yeah. But let's get back to the Karankawas.
Sure.
Walk me through the life cycle or the cycle that they would go through a year where they did move from one place to another based on the resources. And after that, I'm curious about what you've discovered about like their belief system, the way they looked at the world, how they saw themselves in the world, their part in it. If you could touch on that.
Sure. So I'll start with the kind of the seasonal life of the Karankawas, and I'll move on to their customs and their beliefs.
Okay.
So seasonally, in the winter and the fall and the winter, you would have the Karankawas living on their barrier islands. And they're doing this because there's much more access to fish during this time. So they're living in large settlements. They're hunting fish. They're gathering oysters, digging up cattail roots. They're eating a very diverse diet. Archaeologists have looked at their campsites and these village settlements, and they're finding hundreds of different varieties of possible food sources. So they're eating alligators, they're eating dolphins, porpoises, they're eating sharks, they're eating turtles. So they have a really wide, variety of sustenance. But come spring and summer, when it gets warmer, you have the bison being much more active in the area. You also have the deer being much more active in the area. And so they would move to the mainland in smaller groups. Usually it seems to be like family groups of 20, 30, 40, 50, and develop campsites on rivers and then hunt for bison and deer in the space. And when they are hunting for bison, we also see that they are joining other native groups like the Coatecan people, the Tonkawas, and hunting as a larger group to take down bison. And so that's kind of the seasonal movement back and forth. And whenever they are moving back to the barrier islands, they're moving back to the same exact spots. When they move to the mainland, they move to very similar spots as well. There's a book by Dan Worrell, came out recently. It's called The Prehistory of Houston, I believe, and it's phenomenal. And he has maps there that show the rivers. And if you're interested in this subject and you go out to a creek or river that leads all the way to the coast and you start digging around, there's a really good chance you're going to find native artifacts. There's so many campsites along these creek beds and these rivers. Both of these waterways obviously changed drastically throughout the centuries, but if you just pull up the river map, that's a better indicator of where native peoples live than just on random spots of land. Okay, so I'll move on to customs and beliefs. The Karankawas' beliefs are really hard to pin down accurately. the best source that we have today are the living Karankawas Kade members who remember what their ancestors told them, what their grandmother told them about their culture. Because prior, from the 1800s to the first contact, we really don't get any sources from the Karankawas themselves talking about their belief system. Really, the only source we get is from a priest named Father Gaspar de Solis. And Solis's account, he is visiting Texas missions, and he goes to Mission Rosario, which is near the coast, and he hates the Karankawas. They are just coming to the mission, they're taking all the food, all these gifts, and they just go back to the coast. They're not worshiping God as he should be worshipped. They're not working. They're being lazy in his eyes, and so he just trashes them. He considers them to be like the most vile people in Texas, and this is where all these like myths stem from. He talks about how they're rampant cannibals, and he also, tying this back into the question, he also writes about their religious beliefs, but these religious beliefs are hard to validate because all the other information he's writing about is inaccurate, and so we really don't know in accuracy what the Karankawas' religious beliefs were, what they thought of the world around them. But we do know they had some ceremonies, and we see these ceremonies throughout their time on the coast. My favorite is that every single morning, despite the weather, despite if it was freezing cold or extremely hot, they would go bathe in the water that they were living around. So there's actually these amazing sources of these French children living with the Karankawas, and they write about how ridiculous it is that the Karankawas, when it's freezing cold and the river is iced up, the Karankawas would go out there, break a hole in the ice, and jump in the river to bathe themselves. So that was one custom. They're obsessed with cleanliness in that sense. The next custom is the black drink. So what would happen is whenever you have one Karankawa individual traveling to another clan's campsite, they would be welcomed with yopon tea. And so they would grind up the yopon leaves, which have natural caffeine. They would add some possible berries, and they would give it to that individual traveling to a clan's campsite to refresh them. So that was one of the black drinks. Another black drink we see was used in rituals, and it seems like mountain laurel berries were used in this ritualistic black drink, and whenever they would drink this, it would cause them to vomit, and they'd be dancing and vomiting, and it seems hallucinating as they continued the ritual. And so those are kind of the two forms of black drinks we saw throughout their history. And then the last thing I'll touch on in terms of customs is something that I think is like absolutely fascinating. And the Karankawas had this awesome network of communication on the coast. Because everything's so flat, what they would do is just create a fire, and they had this intricate system of smoke signals. So whenever they needed to tell all the other Karankawa people what was going on in their area, they would just build a fire and like create smoke signals to alert the Karankawa people. So in the article I write about the Karankawa-Spanish War, that comes in it's really handy in that you would have these Karankawa scouts seeing these Spanish expeditions coming to try to kill the Karankawa people, and these scouts could just build a fire, put up some smoke, create smoke in a certain way to tell the other Indians around the area that the Spaniards are coming, and then they could all move away and not be worried about it. And the Spaniards would try to put up their own smoke signals because they didn't know like the how to put up the smoke properly, about how to like distribute it to make it say something, that nothing would ever happen, and it just indicate their location. So those are the most common customs and beliefs that I could think of, at least off the top of my head.
That's excellent. I've had you on for almost an hour now, and I appreciate all the time. I could probably go on for another 2 or 3 hours just asking you questions and talking about different issues. And so I do want to have you come back sometime if you'd be interested, especially when your book comes out. After I read it, I'd like to talk to you about that. I did have 2 questions asked by listeners. We've already touched on one. Omar Reyna asked what became of the Karankawas people once the Spanish arrived. You pretty much very well addressed that. And then you just touched on another one. And it's kind of the elephant in the room. It's the one that everybody talks about. And the Karankawas were hammered with it. The Tonkawas were hammered with this. And it's and Jennifer Sheffield asked the question, what's up with the cannibalism? Was it real? Did it happen? And I've discovered things that I've read, and I actually get a mixed. Different people say modern scholars have different arguments. What is your take on that?
Yes, I'm very familiar with this subject, and it's a very tricky subject because you don't want to, harp on it so much where people only identify the Karankawas as cannibals. But I'm glad we're talking about it. I'm glad I could kind of debunk some of these myths. The simplest answer is yes. The Karankawas did practice a very limited ritualistic cannibalism all the way up until around the beginning of the 1700s. So after the 1700s, after 1700 and onward, we don't see I've never found any primary source, so a source from that period at that time, which talks about the Karankawas practicing cannibalism. I don't find any eyewitness accounts of that. But prior to then, there are definitely, I think, enough accounts to prove that, yes, these people did practice anthropophagy. And so it looked much different than what we hear about today. What the Karankawas would do is they would only eat the warriors of their enemies. Mm-hmm. And so during war, they would hunt down somebody, they would kill that person, they wouldn't torture them and eat them while they were still alive. They would kill that person, and they would eat small pieces of that person's body. And what that served to do was to negate that person accessing the afterlife, because it seems a custom of Native groups in the Gulf Coast region is that when you die, your physical body moves with you to the afterlife. And so in grave sites, you actually see Native groups giving recently deceased people like fire starters or buffalo hides to protect them if the weather was bad, or their bow and arrow. And so if you eat somebody, you take away their body, they can't continue on in the afterlife. Mm-hmm. This is only reserved for ancient enemies. There's no evidence of this ever happening to a European. And then all the other groups in this area practice the same type of cannibalism. But around the 1700s, it seems like this practice really fell off. Mm-hmm. A lot of this is probably to do with the interaction with the Europeans and just, cultural dynamics shifting with disease decimating all these populations. Mm-hmm. But the significant thing for me to point out is that even though the Karankawas stopped their cannibalism at this point, the Europeans and the white newcomers to Texas really latch onto it, and they say that the Karankawas were intrepid and very active cannibals, that they actively hunted down children, kidnapped them, and ate them alive, that they would capture a victim, tie them up to a stake, dance around them, and then cut off pieces of their skin and eat them. And that's just not at all accurate. There's no evidence of that at all. But what these colonizers are doing are using cannibalism to make these Native people seem less human, and that allows them to justify their extermination campaigns and genocide, which we see later on. Now, the Spaniards, they try the same thing. They try to label these Karankawas as cannibals. They try to exterminate them, but it does not work out at all. But when the Anglo-Americans come in, they do the same thing, and they're much more active, mm-hmm. and they're much more effective in their extermination campaigns, and are, in a large extent, successful. But I think the most ironic thing is that while these Europeans are saying that Karankawas practice cannibalism and are making this up essentially as propaganda, mm-hmm. they themselves back in Europe are participating in anthropophagy themselves, where they have these medical tinctures and this medicine which is ground up human flesh. And this is extremely common throughout Enlightenment in Europe. And so while the Europeans are practicing cannibalism itself, they see it as more enlightened and more scientific. Therefore, it's not the horrific cannibalism they associate with Native peoples.
Well, that's fascinating. That's definitely something I've not been familiar with. That's interesting there. Yeah, that pretty much sums up what I've gathered. Even the Himalayan and the Lakota book surprised me. I had not heard about they practiced something similar farther up north, from where the Lakota originally, their enemies would practice forms of that. We've covered, let's see, you've got the website, Karankawas.com, which is absolutely amazing. Keep up the good work on that.
Thank you.
You've got your research on the Karankawas that you're working on now. You've got your book coming out. Definitely want you to come back when the book is out. We'll talk about it again. We've talked about your adventures on the coast, learned that you've been up the Appalachian Trail. Probably could sit and ask you questions about that for a long time. Not going to bother you with that right now. We've covered the listeners' questions. We've kind of got a pretty good foundation from you on the Karankawas. We've learned a lot about the presidial life. And that's a fascinating thing to me. I'm really looking forward to learning more about that, because that's one of the aspects I want to understand is, we can look at these, we like to categorize peoples, like the Karankawas, we give them this name for that group. They didn't consider themselves, each band considered themselves, as it were, just like the Coatacons. They weren't Coatacons. There are peoples that we categorize as Coatacons. They say, no, I'm not, especially down in like northern Mexico. But that's how we do. We like to categorize things in time periods. We like to draw maps and show, well, this is the extent of this great empire. But, unless you can actually access the resources, it's not really yours. So we've covered that. Is there anything else you want to touch on? If anybody's interested in asking you questions or reaching out to you, is there contact information you'd like to share, or should they just go to your website?
First, I just want to thank you for having me on. It's been a real pleasure. I'm happy to talk about my research. So thank you so much. In terms of contacting me, I'm definitely open for people to reach out. The best way to do so is to type in Karankawas.com and go to the contact button /form. And if you don't know how to spell Karankawas, just go into Google and just try to type it as best as you can. Yeah. And my site will usually be the first. If you have any information on these peoples, if you yourself identify as Karankawa and are not part of the Karankawa, definitely reach out, and I would love to chat with you too. So again, Michael, thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you so much, and anytime you feel like talking about something, just let me know. We'll work it out. I apologize for the technical issues we dealt with earlier. We worked that out and persevered. It's been a delight talking to you. Good luck in your work, and I'm excited to follow you as you continue your studies and see what happens to you in the future there.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thanks, Tim. All right. Wow, that was a lot of fun talking with Tim there. So let's take a quick break and thank Asia Radio for hosting the show, and we'll be back with some closing thoughts and some announcements.